We'll start. Okay, so we have this very interesting, sort of hard, but I don't think as hard as the Turning essay to read. It's sort of somehow more sobering. He's writing for a different audience than the businessmen in Bremen who can stand these very heavy-duty things like the Turning and the Danger, which hasn't even been translated yet. But there's always some new gimmick, it seems to me, that Heidegger has that makes it hard to understand on purpose. I think he wants to make it hard to understand, not because he wants to be a kind of obscure oracular prophet, but because he's only got sort of a few simple ideas, but he wants you to have to think them through from scratch again and not learn sort of slogans that will make you think you've got it. So this time, he's pulling this reversal in which, after saying that we must overcome metaphysics and outgrow metaphysics and leave metaphysics behind and things like that, he's now saying we've got to recover metaphysics. That's a shocker, and that's supposed to wake up Heidegger fans and make them wonder whether they've missed it all along or what's going on. And moreover, it seems to me, what he's doing is playing around with some very important ambiguities. I mean, the key to understanding this particular essay, I think, just like I think the key to understanding the Turning, though I'm not sure, is to sort out who all the we's are. The key to understanding this is to realize that metaphysics is ambiguous, recovery is ambiguous, nihilism is ambiguous. They've all got a positive and negative way you can hear them. And he's really exploiting those ambiguities. And if you think that those words all just mean the same thing every time they come around, you can't understand a thing. But if you try to sort them out into their positive and negative versions, I think it all begins to make sense. But before I go to the question of being, I got to say a few things in review from last time, where we just have to try to sort of sort something out and admit that we don't understand it, and tell you what we do understand. We meaning the TAs and the graduate students and everybody I talk to that I try to get help from. Okay, it's this business of pain. I just have to go back for maybe 5 or 10 minutes and just try to make sense out of it. Because pain comes up again in this essay. If it didn't, I would just say forget it. But since it comes up again, we'll have to take it up again. Well, the first thing to say, and it's sort of interesting, remember we ended last time, if you can remember clear back there, everybody was trying to understand what this business of grief. And there was this interesting idea. Remember, it said you should get over the loss of we should turn in to a new understanding of being, the way one gets over pain or grief. Maybe I should just tell you the page, but what I'm going to tell you is that's a mistranslation and involves a lot of very interesting speculation on my part too, earlier on, but it was just wrong and you shouldn't wallow in it or write about it in your papers. So where's the Turning? Okay, in the Turning, which you may not have with you, but you don't need to, we just want to read one place on page 39. This restoring surmounting, which is what he wants to do, getting over technology, overcoming technology. This restoring surmounting is similar to what happens when, in the human realm, one gets over grief or pain. Well, grief isn't in it. It's just German Schmerz, which is just plain old pain. It could, if you had to stretch it, mean grief, but there's no excuse for stretching it. There's another word for grief, which is Trauer, and Heidegger isn't using it. So the ingenious proposals which were in the air about how in grief you have to interiorize the person you've lost, and that's an important part of the grieving process, and you keep them with you in some interiorized way as you go on in your life, all that is not relevant. In fact, probably not even pain is relevant because in any sense that you normally would have it, because he's told you already when he did pain and the threshold that when he says pain, he doesn't mean some psychological state, some experiences. But here, I don't think it's important at this point to worry about what pain means anyway, because this is just a sort of obvious point about how to interpret a text. When he hasn't said anything about pain anywhere up to here, and he doesn't say anything about pain anywhere after here, it's unlikely that he's saying anything important about pain except that you get over it. You get over pain and you get over technology, but if you can't sort of bear down on the phenomenology of how you get over pain to try to find out how you get over technology, what I'm really saying is you shouldn't try to get anything out of that passage. But of course, that doesn't solve the problem about pain, because he may not be making a big fuss about pain in that passage, but he sure does in the passage in what's it called? Language, the plain language, which is the threshold between the wanderers and the room with the bread and wine, this sort of nearest thing we got to a celebratory meal thing world, such situation. And the threshold is petrified by pain. And what in the world is that all about? Well, as I wouldn't worry about it again, except that he's trying again to make some sense of pain and not helping, as I can see on page 306 of what we just read, where he's got the Greek word for pain, and he's saying that what pain means is intimate gathering. Pain would be that which gathers most intimately. So we have to think about what that could mean, and why, and we also know. Don't expect this to lead to some answer. I'm afraid. I'm just telling you the problem. There's pain gathering intimately. In the language essay, pain is the rift, and the word rift is risk, and risk can also mean tear. So there is a kind of association there where you might think it had something to do with the lacerations of tearing a ligament or something, but it doesn't seem to, remember, because it's not meant to be psychological. And we know what the risk is. He tells us it's the difference between world and thing, between the open. Now I'm going to go on and say some things, but I don't think they're going to help much. So the rift is the difference between the open and the thing which holds the open open. It's got to do with the way appropriating works to gather things together in their temporary, local, self-contained world, and bring things and people out into their own, and separate the near from the far. All that's going on, but why would you want to call it pain? Well, I haven't got anything better than Forrest's suggestion, which is a terrific suggestion, but I'm afraid the German was not helping it much. But anyway, the suggestion is that pain equals suffering. Suffering is in the old way of talking, the opposite of action. Passion once upon a time meant receptive, letting something happen to you as opposed to action. And suffering meant letting something happen to you as opposed to action. And of course, Heidegger's been talking about receptivity, and that willful acting isn't going to get you anywhere. So what you've got to learn is to be open to the call of being, open to be gathered by the arrivedness. You're always in the position of suffering, not acting in this sense of suffering. Well, that would be nice. And for want of anything better, I'm telling it. Unfortunately, there is a word in German, Leiden, which is the word for suffering and passion in that old-fashioned sense, and Heidegger's using Schmerz, which is just a plain old word for pain, like a headache or a pain in your foot. So I'm not, but that can't get any further. I'm ready to listen to any suggestions. Yeah.
Well, this is just my sort of personal take on it. To me, it is associated with sort of this longing, not that it's longing, but the way we understand longing, where like there's this intimacy that never can sort of be dissolved. Like, you have two things that are in this intimate relationships.
Same
They
world.
can never be,
Us
they can
do.
never be melded into one.
Right. And good, because it would be bad
Yeah.
if they were. So there's this togetherness that isn't melded into one. That's true of thing and world, and if and good thing too, or it would all be one big gathered together bunch of the way technicity tends for everything being gathered into one big bunch of resources. So we want to keep separate thing and world, and we want to keep separate us and being. A lot of talk about that in here, though they are so intimately related that they're not separate entities. You can't make any sense out of any one of them apart from the other. We mustn't equate them with each other either. That's a structural thing and world, and of human beings and being. Now, the question is why that would be called pain. I mean, it's as if you're trying to say they want to be more intimate, but they can't. But where does that come
I
from?
mean, we sort of, that's the sort of pain of the experience.
Right. Well, that's a kind of suffering.
And it's directly related with that kind of.
Well, yeah, the only thing I disagree
You
with.
don't always want to just meld with.
Right.
We have longing for.
Right. Well, you're talking like the symposium.
You don't always have a desire to just become one. Right. The intimacy is sort of like this weird.
Okay, but if, but you remember tomorrow they're doing the symposium, right? We could put in a plug for that, and that's the Aristophanes story about this desire to become one. But
longing usually isn't the desire to become one.
But the trouble is,
but it's sort of like.
Yeah, but the trouble is, there's the problem about the longing. I mean, who's longing for what? The thing for the world for the thing. That's too psychological. But you want to use that as a metaphor. That these two things, the metaphor is that the two components, world and thing, or human beings and beings, are sort of drawn to be as close as they can to being sort of absolutely together, and yet at the same time, to be what they are, they have to stay to in some sense apart, and that the metaphor there is pain. Well, it's okay with. I mean, I'm not convinced, but but it's not as if I have anything better to say. I think it's a good try. I don't think we should spend more time on it. I think it's a kind of dead end. Though, if anybody has the answer, run and tell me in office hours, or write an A+ paper on it. It would be counterproductive to just sit here and beat our heads against it for the next hour. So I'm going to go on. I just felt that I owed you, if nothing else, an explanation, the understanding that if you can't understand it, you're not alone. Don't feel that you're missing something, at least nothing that we understand. Okay. Now we're going on to the question of being, for which I have the rest of the lecture, and only the rest of the lecture, because I want to do a kind of summary next time. Okay, so Heidegger wants to discuss nihilism and how to recover from it, and you're going to recover from it by recovering its essence. This is already to begin to be those very interesting ambiguities about recovering, which go through this. But he begins by doing not. We'll get to nihilism by the end of the lecture, I presume. But what we're going to start with metaphysics, because he also wants to do this kind of ambiguous recovering with metaphysics. He wants to recover what metaphysics got right, and he also wants to sort of uncover what metaphysics covered up, and in that sense, recover that too, which is to recover where metaphysics got something wrong. But he certainly doesn't anymore think we should just get over metaphysics and overcome it and leave it behind. There's something very important in what motivates metaphysics. Motivates is too psychological a term, but what leads to metaphysics, let's say. And there's something very important that's covered up by metaphysics, but metaphysics is the clue to this important something covered up by metaphysics. So we have to work our way through these ambiguities. And we'll begin with what recovery means and what it is for metaphysics to recover, or for us to recover from metaphysics, or what we're going to recover from metaphysics, or how. I mean, all these overtones are in this one German word Verbindung that's playing around here. To begin with, then, and there are going to be several stages to this. Metaphysics is itself ambiguous. He doesn't stress that in here, but I can't understand what's going on in a lot of the Heidegger at this stage if I don't make clear to myself and to you that his notion of metaphysics he's got really two different notions of metaphysics. And they sometimes, and that ambiguity gets very interesting because relative to one kind of metaphysics is these evaluated terms are not supposed to be taken sort of ethically, but they're just sort of shorthand. One kind of metaphysics is a lot more dangerous, let's put it, than the other kind of metaphysics. And both kinds of metaphysics also have their positive aspects. But let me just distinguish the kinds of metaphysics. That is, there are several, I think, this is a kind of review, not so much of this book, but what we've been hearing since the essay on the question of being. Metaphysics has several different traits or characteristics. And at various points, there are various stages in the West in which metaphysics has some of them, but not all of them. And that makes it complicated. I think that metaphysics has three characteristics. That in metaphysics, being is reified and treated as a being. Truth as aletheia is lost and replaced by truth as correspondence. And metaphysics is totalized. It always has some understanding of what everything is. Now, I'm going to just take those up in the order I listed them. So, when metaphysics is reified, that is, treating being as a being, then metaphysics is ontotheology. It always thinks that ordinary beings get their intelligibility and their existence from some highest being. And being really isn't an entity or a super entity or the totality of entities, but metaphysics always thinks it is or treats it as. Now, there are places I will read you passages related to what I'm saying about all this. So on page 306, the second paragraph, the third sentence. What if the language of metaphysics and metaphysics itself, whether it is that of the living God or of the dead God, in fact constituted as metaphysics, that limit that prevents a transition over the line, that is the overcoming of nihilism? Well, that's a funny passage, but I mean, that's a neat passage, because if you thought that Heidegger thinks that if there was a living God, we'd be out of nihilism and out of metaphysics, you missed it. I mean, that would just be more ontotheology. I mean, even if there's this highest being and everything is organized and people worship this highest being and they seem to have meaning in their lives when they're doing it, as in medieval understanding of being, that's still metaphysics, and there's still something wrong with it because it thinks that all there are beings, and that the ordinary beings get their intelligibility and existence from some other being, which is just another being. And on 315, there's more about this. Over there, I'm going to read for the end of the second full paragraph, starting about 10 lines up. Yet, when the question is concerned with a discussion locating metaphysics as the surpassing of beings by being, now there's another one of these ambiguities. Keep your eye on the ball. The surpassing of beings by being, if you hear it in the Heidegger way, is exactly right. There is something is the wrong way to put it. Being is no being, goes beyond all being. But he's talking here about the wrong way to hear it, that metaphysical way to hear it. So, when discussion locating metaphysics is the surpassing of beings by being, then this surpassing on the part of being immediately calls into question the elements that have been distinguished from one another in that distinction, within which the doctrines of metaphysics have moved since time immemorial. The distinction from which they receive the basic outline of their language This is the distinction between essence and existence, what being and that being. Well, that's all pretty cryptic, but that's got to do with ontotheology. Ontotheology looks for an answer to what being, which is intelligibility, and that being, which is existence. And if you think that and it looks for that answer in something that surpasses ordinary being, and it gets the answer that being is God, or being is the transcendental unity of apperception, or being is the good. And so that's still about metaphysics, where the trouble with metaphysics is that it treats being as an object. And that's why, the first reason, we have to cross out being. Because the word being it's just hopeless. It's been taken over by metaphysics, and it's come to stand for some kind of super entity. Object is a bad word, of course, because it's only a subject-object object. So let's not say treat being as an object. Treat being as an entity. It's tended to treat being as an entity, separate from us, and us as a kind of entity which represents being, where represents doesn't mean now just subject-object Cartesian representation, but that we've got an idea or an understanding or a language which enables us to refer to this being, which is something separate from us and self-sufficient and independent of us. This is just just what you get in all your other courses. Presumably, if you've had 25A, 25B, you've got a lot of metaphysics of this thing, in this sense. And so being's got to get crossed out. This happens on 310, where it says, yeah.
Sorry, did you mean just now when you said that are you talking about the idea that we're made in the image of God, that type of thing?
We're made in the image of God. No, what, did I say something like that?
I didn't know if that's what you had in mind.
No.
It was
well,
your part that were made by this larger.
Oh, well, yeah, one verse.
And have this idea because we're supposed to have.
Okay, good. I see what you mean. This is the kind of thing you get in the other courses. I mean, that's one of the versions of it. One version is the super being is God, and God is self-sufficient, and God has made us, and He's put in us the need for God and the image of God so that we direct ourselves toward God and have a conception of God in Augustine or in Descartes to get versions of this. That's one form of metaphysics, but it needn't be that. I mean, it could be naturalism. It could be that what there is just the totality of natural stuff, and that's going to be the ground of everything and the explanation of everything. That's a sort of pretty minimal, degenerate form of metaphysics. I jumped to that. We could have Plato would be a middle ground kind of one. There is the good. It isn't that the good has actually created us, but nonetheless, the good is what makes everything intelligible, makes everything grow, and we have in us innate ideas that enable us to relate to the good. Yeah.
What is he called?
Well, this is the ambiguity game he's playing. It's a wrong understanding of the surpassing of beings by being when you hear it the following way. For instance, to take her example, all us ordinary creatures are surpassed by God. So we're the beings, and God's the being, and there it is. Metaphysics takes what is right, that in some way surpasses beings, and decides that yes, indeed, and there's a kind of super being, and it's very different, and it's much, and that's what's in the passage. That's just what happens if we keep reading. Where am I reading? 310? No. Three. Where did I start? Where did I? I am. Why do I have this open? Yeah. What's that?
I interrupted you right before you started.
I see. I went from 3:15. That's right. Where I was talking about ontotheology to 3:10, because on 3:10, that's right. I was just reading the crossed out, and where he crosses it out, about 15 lines from the bottom, where it says 329 there, he crosses out being, and then he says, the crossing out of this word initially has only a preventative role, namely that of preventing the almost ineradicable habit of representing being as something standing somewhere on its own, that then on occasion first comes face to face with human beings. So that's another way of describing this wrong way of thinking about beings. And the positive way, which he immediately turns to, which he still says, but you can, again, this ambiguity. The more I think about it, the more I think everything that this whole text is about there's a negative, wrong way of understanding it, but a way which is trying to get at something, but is distorting it. And then there's the right way of understanding it, what that is trying to get at when you get it, so to speak. I hate to say right because it sounds like correspondence, but when you, I can't think of any other way to say it, when you describe the phenomena. So, and what happens here is the positive version is when you cross out being at the bottom, and you think of the crossing out of it as representing the fourfold, then you understand and show in that funny way of doing it what's going on when there is both entities and something that surpasses them, namely world, and they're in this tight relation where they're intimate with each other and need each other, but are not totally fused with each other. And that's what he goes on to say at the bottom. From what has been said, the sign of this crossing, though, cannot, however, be the merely negative sign of crossing out. It points rather towards the four regions of the fourfold, and they're being gathered, there's the arriveness, in the locale of this crossing through. That's the localness of the temporary and local world. That's what he thinks at this stage of his thinking is what the relation between beings and being should have been trying to think, was trying to think all along, but it unfortunately never got his thought until Heidegger. But now, finally, Heidegger is telling us the undistorted version. Worried for us. Are you worried? Oh, okay. So let's see now. So that's fine. Now that's really the main thing I want to say. But now I want to say some things just for you to help you not get lost in all the other ambiguities which are not central to this text. Namely, that it's not that metaphysics isn't always ontotheology in later Heidegger. So you've got to keep your eyes open and pay attention to the context. Every thinker from Plato through Nietzsche is a metaphysician in the ontotheological sense. Even Nietzsche has this will to power force, which explains the existence and the meaning, or whatever kind of meaning might not be the right word anymore, but the intelligibility of everything. And certainly Plato's got it. But, and from Plato on too, and this is very important, and now I want to go to the, oh, wait, I don't want to confuse you, but we've got to do the three characteristics. So we've done the super entity characteristic, but the next characteristic is, remember, to forget aletheia and get correspondence. So also, every thinker from Plato through Nietzsche thought they were getting it right about what there ultimately was. And so they not only had some kind of ontotheology, the, so to speak, kind of being that explains all the other kinds of being, but they also had the claim that that was just the truth in the sense of correspondence truth. And so there, and those are the really sort of full-fledged metaphysicians. But now, sometimes Heidegger says, and I used to be very worried and confused about this, but I've just gotten used to it now, that from Anaximander, 700 BC, and then Heraclitus and Parmenides, these big heroes from Methuselah's temple time, right through technology, we have metaphysics. Now, let me talk about these two sort of ends of this history. Why are Anaximander and Parmenides and Heraclitus metaphysicians? They are not ontotheologians. They don't have a correspondence theory of truth, but they've got the totalizing thing. Remember that perhaps the crucial thing about metaphysics, if we think about it as what is unique in the history of the West, is that starting with Anaximander, thinkers in the West got the idea that there was something that you could say, of everything that was what it was to be. And when you think that, whether you think it's just custom or Brauch, which is what Anaximander says, or Physis, which is what Heraclitus and Parmenides, I guess each in their own way, say, according to Heidegger, you are doing this kind of totalizing story about what is, and that makes you a metaphysician in this broader sense. Of course, all the ontotheological people, from Plato to Nietzsche, also are totalizers. There's no question about that. It's just that there are totalizers before you get ontotheology and correspondence. And there's this funny fact about technology, which makes it more like the beginning. It's kind of, instead of being pre-ontotheological, it's post-ontotheological. And the technicity doesn't have any center anymore, doesn't have any basic principle in terms of which the thinkers of technicity explain everything. It doesn't even have any thinkers anymore. It's just, but it's still a clearing, and it's still totalizing. And technicity, the practices of technicity treat everything as resources. It doesn't have a correspondence theory of truth, and it does not have one. Just like the pre-Socratics, they didn't have a correspondence theory, but they didn't deny it either. They didn't have an aletheia theory. They just didn't have a story about truth. And technicity, I think, has no story about truth. It doesn't say that it's just true, everything is resources. It doesn't do metaphysics. The practices just work in this way that everything gets treated as resources. And that makes it metaphysics. And the evidence for that is, just as there are texts where Heidegger says Anaximander is the first metaphysician. In fact, I think you read one. I'm pretty sure he says that in the Way Back into the Ground of Metaphysics. Anybody remember? I think he says from Anaximander to Nietzsche. But anyway, he does say it. And in the Nietzsche books, it says Nietzsche is the penultimate stage of metaphysics. That can only mean that technicity is the last stage of metaphysics. And that can only mean because it's totalized. So this is just keep you sort of oriented in all the strange terminology. So let's see now. And all the metaphysicians have in common, here's another thing you could put it, or another way you could put it, that even the ones who didn't think truth is correctness, I sort of said this already, didn't interrogate the clearing, didn't thematize the clearing either. They weren't fully in touch with the clearing and the way the clearing worked. If they had been, their practices wouldn't have let Plato make the move he did toward correspondence. And what all metaphysicians have in common then is that they don't think the clearing as the clearing. Heidegger says he's the first to have done it in 2,000 years, meaning the first period. I mean, the first to have done it, period, because nobody else did it in the West. And because they didn't, they lead to Plato, and Plato's already a kind of nihilism because he's lost touch with the clearing by treating it as an object, meaning the good. I mean, you got to. I keep saying this, but it's such a subtle point. The clearing is what explains. Well, explains may not be the right word. I don't know. By virtue of the clearing is that on the basis of which, let's talk like Heidegger, entities show up as anything. And therefore, the clearing does the job that the ontotheology people think God or the good does. But once you get rid of that idea and forget the clearing and substitute a being like Plato does, the good, then eventually, step by step, you'll get to a unworld that we're in now, in which there are just beings batting around and getting more and more maximized. And so the idea is what all metaphysics has in common is that fails to think the clearing, and that's a kind of oblivion, a kind of forgetting, which eventually, and you have to go through the whole story, which we're not going to do, will lead to technicity and nihilism. He's talking about that on 313. The very abbreviated story you can read there. Here, the main paragraph about it is the second one in 313. The zone of the critical line, that is the locality of the essence of consummate nihilism, would thus have to be thought where the essence of metaphysics unfolds its most extreme possibilities and gathers itself inward. Well, the essence of metaphysics, as I understand it here, is not thinking the clearing. And now what happens then? This occurs, and finally that leads to, and then you get all these candidates for where things come from and where the meaning of everything comes from, and you finally end up with it in Nietzsche. It's the will to will, that where the will to will, that is, challenges, sets in place everything that presences, and does so solely in the thoroughgoing and uniform orderability of its standing reserve. As the unconditional gathering of such setting in place, being does not disappear. Now, what does that mean? Well, that means being can't disappear, because being is the name for the mode of givenness, to talk like the technology essay, that there's a clearing at all. And there is a clearing, because things are all showing up as resources. I mean, every stuff is showing up as resources. Or to put it in my way, the practices are still having a style and letting everything show up as something. So the being doesn't disappear, but it erupts in a singular uncanniness. I mean, and then we get all this story about how the practices have a style which denies that there are practices, and denies that there is a style, and denies that there's a clearing, but nonetheless orders everything. Only what, okay, that's it, but then he talks about Hegel, and that's not going to help us any. And more in the next paragraph. The disappearance of what was previously present is not a vanishing of presencing. Rather, presencing presumably withdraws. That means, again, the clearing withdraws. The clearing withdraws, starting with Plato, but it gets more and more withdrawn until and you see the difference of the ontotheological metaphysicians. The clearing's already withdrawn. The clearing's already forgotten. But they're putting in something else to do the job of the clearing, because they think they need something to explain why anything is there and showing up as anything. When the clearing gets really withdrawn, it gets denied so completely that it's not only distorted, but it's just forgotten. And that's what happens when you get to technology. It presumably withdraws, yet such withdrawal remains concealed from representation as nihilistically determined. What is that? Well, that means, well, never mind. Don't think about that, because that's got to do with the ambiguity of nihilism, which we're going to get to at the end. It appears as though that which presences in the manner of standing reserve were self-sufficient. Well, I'll give you a clue. We'll come back to it. Nihilism can be understood as saying that there are beings and nothing else. When nihilism means there are beings and nothing else, that makes it look as if standing reserve were self-sufficient. And now, instead of some super being that is self-sufficient, to explain ordinary beings that aren't self-sufficient, ordinary beings are just self-sufficient, and that's the last stage of this forgetting of the clearing. This talk here gets clearer in the last paragraph. In the phase of consummate nihilism, it looks as though there were no such things as the being of beings, whatever this other thing is, as though there were nothing, in the sense of a negative nothing, to be. I'm putting that as if there was nothing other than just ordinary beings. Being remains absent in a strange way. It conceals itself. It maintains itself in the concealment that conceals itself. You see, it's always there. You got to keep saying there is a clearing. Our practices are still clearing. We're still receiving. We're still preserving. But what we're receiving and preserving is this strange understanding that there's nothing but beings. It's a very contradictory situation. In such conceiving, however, there lies the essence of oblivion as experienced by the Greeks. Okay, well now we switch to a positive kind of oblivion. I'm not ready for that. Not quite. Okay. The transition is that having talked about what metaphysics leaves out, we're going to switch to a more positive story about metaphysics. And on 314 at the top. For ordinary, and this is again the ambiguity story. For ordinary representation, being oblivious readily takes on the appearance of merely missing something, of a lack, of something unfortunate. Well, I've been talking that way, as if, boy, did metaphysics miss something, and look and how far we've got, how much we miss. But he thinks that we don't really understand oblivion if we think of it as just hidden or forgetfulness. He says we habitually take oblivion and forgetfulness as omission. We don't really understand the essence of oblivion. I'm skipping a little. Yet even where we have caught sight of the essence of oblivion in its full extent, we too readily run the danger of it as thinking of it as something that we've done. So all of this is wrong about oblivion. It isn't something we do, and it isn't necessarily something bad, something negative, some loss. It could be turned around and thought about in 2 ways, 3 ways, as something positive. And that's what we're going to do now. And that's, again, the ambiguity of this. Now, the first way is that we've already covered, but I'll review it. I mean, when the metaphysicians, the way the metaphysicians forget being is not completely negative, because what they all think is that there's something more than just beings. And insofar as they thought there was something more than just being, they understood that there was something hidden from everyday practical understanding that was essential to everyday practical understanding, or sort of that on the basis of which there could be ordinary things and we could cope with them. And they thought that this was concealed from ordinary understanding. So far, so good. And then what did they say after that? Just to see if we're still awake. So far, they were doing fine. And then what did they say? If something concealed from ordinary understanding and ordinary coping, it makes ordinary understanding and coping possible. That's terrific. And then what? What did they say where did they go wrong? Yeah, it was another being, just not ordinary and special, a super being of some sort. And but they were right up to then. And so we've got to recover what they got right, namely that there's more than just beings. This is what he says on 312. This is the story about the surpassing. I mean, they were right about the surpassing of beings. That's how to describe the good thing they had. The bottom of the middle of the second paragraph. Everywhere the surpassing that returns to beings, the transcendent, pure, and simple, the being of beings. Everywhere what? Everywhere the surpassing that returns to beings, the transcendent, pure, and simple is the being of beings. Surpassing is metaphysics itself. See, I was saying something like that. I mean, what is, from beginning to end, metaphysics has the understanding that there's something more going on that makes it possible for the everyday goings on. Surpassing is metaphysics itself, where this name now refers to a doctrine and discipline of philosophy. Sorry, not to a doctrine or discipline of philosophy, but rather to the fact that such surpassing is given. That's got to do with he's making a big deal about this given later, but we don't need that right now. It is given to the extent that it is brought into the path of its prevailing, destined. The incalculable fullness and suddenness of what unfolds as surpassing is called the destiny of metaphysics. Okay, that is the idea that what's the amazing thing that unfolds, the destiny of metaphysics, is that there is this sense that there is a surpassing. that there's something more than the totality of entities. And that's all you can get out of this so far. That's the first positive thing to recover. Now, the next thing is, what should we recover that is necessarily hidden and should be hidden, that was hidden from metaphysics in the wrong way? That's where it really gets interesting, and that's where this sort of ambiguity of recover is very important. Or to put it another way, this is where we switch from a negative kind of oblivion, or something in between, this thing where you sense something else is there, but you don't know what. You get it wrong when you try to figure it out, to a positive kind of oblivion, an account of what is hidden and should be hidden. And Heidegger now can tell us about it, though metaphysics didn't have a clue. And can you guess, I mean, what's hidden and should be hidden that Heidegger's revealed that metaphysics doesn't have a clue about? What if I give you a clue, like what necessarily withdraws in order for us to encounter anything? Somebody better know the answer to that. The clearing. Right. The clearing is necessarily hidden. And it's a good thing, too. And because it withdraws, remember, like the illumination in the room, or like the soil out of which the tree of metaphysics grows, it's got to stay in the background. And in order for whatever it is that goes on and becomes intelligible, and all our work with beings, even metaphysics and all its talk about super beings, all feeds out of this background, which itself doesn't get into the foreground. That's the first. There are two things now, and the other one is much harder for you to know. I don't think I've really ever talked about it, and it's going to be the most important thing I'm going to talk about today when I get to it. But besides what's withdrawn, there is something that is sheltered. And now, but wait for a moment about the sheltered. Let's get certainly the withdrawn straight. And that's just, when that we talked about plenty. And I don't know why you look at me blank like that. I think this won't be so obvious. There's nobody in there. I wouldn't be asking you. I hope that's what you think. On 314, I take it that that's what he's talking about toward the bottom part of that big middle paragraph where he says, unconcealment resides in the concealment of presence. That is, nothing gets revealed unless there is some clearing that is concealed and makes presence impossible. Something like that. That's not a very clear sentence for it, but that's the best I can find for the withdrawal thesis. And it's certainly in here. Okay, let's see. Okay, then I gave myself a bunch of questions, so let me see how they work, if I still believe them. The next thing is we must be sensitive to the clearing and how it works. And the question would be, well, why must we be sensitive to clearing and how it works? As long as it's there and works, why isn't that good enough? Well, if we weren't sensitive to the clearing and how it works, you'd fall into the correspondence theory of truth, that there was just one reality and we got it right about it. But then the question is, and why would that be bad? Well, now we're getting close to something interesting, because it would close off all the other possible clearings. And we lose our sense of ourselves as disclosers and preservers and we would lose our openness to disclosing new worlds, because we would just have the right answer. Yeah.
Would we lose our sense of our essence as disclosers, or would we lose our?
Well, I think it's probably the same thing. What do you think? No, we would use our sense. Is that what I said, or is what you said?
No, we lose the essence, and I think that's right.
We would lose our essence as disclosers if we lost touch with the clearing. I see the problem. No, I can't say that, even though I said it in the notes, because we're still disclosing even the technicity right now. So we'd have to lose our sense of our essence as preservers and disclosers. But what we would then lose is our ability to be innovative, our ability to open up new clearings.
But wouldn't that eventually lead to an end to?
Yes, in the end, we'd end up just resource. And then we would finally lose our essence as disclosers and preservers, and that would mean that there wouldn't even be resources anymore. There would just be stuff and animals. And that's right. That's where it would end up. Okay. But now comes the interesting thing. We just made a transition from the withdrawing of the clearing to what it is that you lose if you're not in touch with the clearing. And what you lose, I just said, remember, is the possibility of other clearings. And that I've never talked about, because I've never really paid much attention to it. But now I think it's really very important. It's the idea that there is what the translator unfortunately calls a reservoir of other possibilities. Yeah. No, sorry, but the translator in The Origin of the Work of Art calls it a reservoir. Here, it's called the untapped treasures in the middle of page 314. And at the end of that same paragraph, it's called that which has been and which is now, which is not past, since it remains that which does not become past in all enduring granting by the event erigness of being in each case. Well, no, I'm not sure that's right. I don't know what that is. Forrest knows what that is. Is that the excess? No, I don't.
That which has been and is not past.
Yeah. Is that the excess? Okay, good. I have trouble with this. Let me explain to you why I'm having trouble with this, and it'll help you understand why I've never talked about it up to now, and why it's a kind of difficult for me to talk about it. Because I've always thought that this treasure were the marginal practices. And I don't think it matters much if it were. I mean, it would be sort of structurally similar to this story. But there is two different stories. That if you have a correspondence metaphysics totalizing view, you lose any sense that there's any truth in the marginal practices. You lose any sense that there's any truth in the anomalies. You lose any capacity to bring about new clearings. That's been my story. I don't think that's really Heidegger's story. Heidegger's story is you lose the capacity to open up new clearings and get in touch with what we decided to call the excess or the abundance of this treasure, which isn't, it's very important, a bunch of particular other clearings around that are possible. We haven't thought about them yet. It's very hard to think about it. Because anything you think about this is going to turn it into a being, and it's going to reify it, and it's going to, you've got to think of it just as the possibility of revealing other clearings. That's the richness. That's all you can say about it.
Yeah, I was going to say why reservoir is bad.
Yeah, the reservoir is bad because it suggests that there's a bunch of sort of a storehouse of other clearings, and that's bad. Treasure isn't much better, because then it still says that, but that's why I'm saying excess or what was the other one? Abundance. Not that that's something, you can hear them all wrong. It's wonderful. It's another lesson in the ambiguity story. A metaphysician can come along and hear excess, well, these other clearings that we haven't got yet, abundance, treasure. You can hear it all wrong. And you've got to hear it without turning it into a being. But you've got to think that, boy, is this a good thing to have around? Good thing, see? I mean, it's great to think that it's there. Well, you better not say a thing. And once you understand what I'm talking about, you'll have to think it. Yeah.
How are these untapped treasure systems in other ethics and other stories?
They aren't. They are exactly that. And we've had some of them. And that's why and once you know that there's a clearing, it's a good thing to put it your way. Then you don't have a correspondence theory. So you don't think that you just got the answer. You're going to have a whole series of worlds. And look what we've got in our historical culture. We've had a whole series of worlds. But there's no reason but we wouldn't have had if it weren't for this excess and abundance, and we can have more as long as we don't lose touch with this excess and abundance. But and now that notice, I just got to keep saying this right. And this is a positive kind of oblivion or hiddenness. It's not as if you could know anything about it or remember it or think it or anything like that. It's got to be oblivion. It's got to be hidden. It's got to be unthinkable. But now Heidegger wants to put a positive spin on that and use a sense of hidden, which also means sheltered. I mean, it's because it's there to be nurtured and preserved in some future world. He thinks of it as hidden and sheltered, and that's fine. And he wants you to but just to confuse you in a productive way, he's going to call that hidden, sheltered oblivion. And he's going to say, you thought oblivion meant forgetting, but here oblivion means hiding and sheltering. And that's the kind of oblivion that we've got to get back, that metaphysics has completely covered up and forgotten. They've got a bad kind of forgetting oblivion, of the good kind of withdrawing and excess, both other kinds of oblivion. Yeah.
But it's only for us getting back to sense of mortality.
The what? Mortality?
Yeah, mortality. That if there's always an excess, then we're always mortal today.
No, I don't, but it sounds intriguing, and I never know what to do with more, so say more.
Well, because there's always an excess.
Yes.
That makes it more finite.
More finite.
Yeah.
Well, yes, I guess I see what you mean. Yeah, I see what you mean. So you, I mean, yes.
So what's being recovered is like gathered.
Okay, I see. I see what you mean. That is, insofar as you're a metaphysician, you're not finite.
You're not gathered.
That's right. And you're not, I mean, really not finite. I mean, Plato talks about being a friend of God. Metaphysicians see things as they really are from God's point of view, and they see it all, and they know it all. Everything important. Now, a lot of contingent details they don't know, but everything important they know. And that means metaphysicians aren't finite, or at least, they're denying that they're finite. If there really was a metaphysical truth, and metaphysicians really knew it, then metaphysicians wouldn't be finite. But since there isn't really a metaphysical truth, but only a clearing, and metaphysicians only know that, then metaphysicians are finite because, as you say, there's an abundance of other clearings which they'll never know and we'll never know, and that gives you a sense of very much not being a friend of God's. Am I following you?
Right. I guess it gives a sense of, yeah, it gives a sense of mortality.
Okay, and you can call it finitude, mortality. I like finitude better. Well, that's a fast move. Tell me more.
We're gathered.
Yeah.
Gathered and important things. So I guess things wouldn't think for a metaphysician.
Yeah, that's what it follows, but that's odd. I haven't really, now you're giving me a puzzle. Why couldn't things think for a metaphysician? I think you're right, they couldn't. And that's because somehow there wouldn't be nearness, because everything would be equally already brought out into its own. Everything, let's take the God story, everything would be a creature of God already. Everything, and there wouldn't be any sort of special local world in which they were brought out into their own. Something like that. And can you help? Yeah.
They would just, because they would be gathered with this.
Yeah, I think that's probably formally right, but can you give me the phenomenon more? I'm just trying to think, what is it like in a world in which, right, so, yeah.
And therefore, it happens. It's not stay for a while, but gathered,
Okay, so I think that's right, but let's just, I want to, tell me about what happens when a metaphysician tries to have a celebratory meal. Yeah. They'd have to what? Yes, that's right. But if they really did, when Leibniz at a celebratory meal somehow doesn't make any sense, I guess. The monads are all there already, and they're already brought out into their own, and it's a pre-established harmony, and all they're having is dinner. Nothing important could be happening, sort of ontologically. I think that's the picture, yeah.
Yeah, like she was saying, philosophy, and we go out and get it.
Right, yeah.
You really lived it.
Yes, if you really lived it, you and June couldn't even have a celebratory meal because it wouldn't last more than keep disappearing every time everybody went out to the kitchen. Okay, so metaphysicians have such a strange view of the world that they really can't have things thinking. I think he's right. Okay, let me see where I am. We're doing fine. We're just going to finish. But we're in now the positive. Oh no, we have a lot to do yet. Well, we'll do it. 313. Did I read that already? No, I was just at this trying to find places now where you get the positive form of oblivion. The bottom of 313. He's talking about the concealing of being, but he's going to do now, it's not a negative nothing. In such concealing there lies the essence of oblivion as experienced by the Greeks. In the end, that is, from the beginning of its essence, such oblivion is nothing negative, as a sheltering in concealment. So that's the sheltering of the excess and the abundance. Rather, it is presumably a sheltering that preserves what is as yet unrevealed. That must be, these other worlds that aren't really there yet, that aren't on some shelf someplace else either. For ordinary representation, being oblivious takes on the appearance of merely missing something and so forth. We've read that. But it turns out that it's got this totally thing. Now we can skip again and read the middle of 314. Correctly thought, it's the third sentence in the big paragraph. Oblivion, the concealing of the as yet unrevealed essence, in the verbal sense of unfolding, of being, shelters untapped treasures. That's what we're calling its excess and the abundance, and is the promise of a find that awaits only the appropriate sequence. So that's turning it all around now. So now let me just review two senses of oblivion as a positive something or other that metaphysics has made inaccessible to us, namely the clearing, which works only when it withdraws, and the abundance of other possible clearings, which you can have once you see that there is no right answer to what reality is. Now, is that okay? That's clear? Yeah.
Does the abundance of other clearing have anything to do with the saving power?
I doubt it, but I have to think about it. Let's see. I know I do. No, I think the saving power is in the let's read it, with the saving power of the humble thing must be things thingy. And that's not the same. I mean, why is that the same? It's a kind of saving power. It's just not what he calls the saving power. But yeah.
But there's also the saving power of the God.
Okay, good. Liz is right. There are two saving powers. It's always the case in late Heidegger, as I keep saying, that there's the track of the things thinking and the dwelling, which is that whether there's ever a new God or not, we can stay true to our essences, disclosures and receivers of local worlds by fostering things thinking. And there is the promise that if we do that right, we can make a place where it may well be that a God will return. And that's another world, and that certainly comes from this excess and abundance that would become accessible to us if we got out of metaphysics. Yeah, good. Okay, one last issue, and that is the ambiguity about the essence of nihilism. Again, it turns out even nihilism has a positive and negative form. He starts talking about that on 320. And he talks about it as a higher ambiguity, about 6 lines from the bottom. He's talking about the going over the line. Well, let's read that. He says, what is the purpose of this letter? This letter to Jung. This is the letter. It attempts to raise into a higher ambiguity the title over the line. That is everything that it describes in your sense and in mine and tries to demonstrate by saying it in writing. This higher ambiguity lets us experience to what extent the overcoming of nihilism demands a turning into its essence, a turning in whereby the desire to overcome becomes untenable. The recovery of metaphysics calls thinking into a more original calling, and I presume the recovery we're now going on to recover something important about nihilism that we're going to find out about. Okay, nihilism says that besides being, there is only nothing. That's the negative kind of nihilism. That's from 316. And this is where he's reviewing what is metaphysics, which we didn't read. We just read the postscript to it. It went way back into the ground metaphysics. But he's saying, look, science, and you could say philosophy too, thinks that they know everything it is, and apart from what they know, there's nothing else. This is the second paragraph, starting about 4 lines down. And then skipping further down, by contrast, okay, never mind by contrast, within the perspective of scientific representation, which is acquainted only with being, that which is not in any way a being, namely being, can present itself only as nothing. So I take that to mean that both the abundance and the clearing which is withdrawn are inaccessible to science and philosophy. Really, you should say something like theory. Theory can't get at any of that. So it looks like there are, to theory and philosophy and metaphysics, however you want to put it, it looks like there are beings and nothing more. And that idea that there are nothing but beings starts with Plato, because even the good is a being. Oh, it isn't real, by the way. Plato says it's beyond being. Heidegger doesn't seem to worry about that. So the nihilism starts with Plato and ends in framing. But but on the other hand, the idea that beings are not everything is also contained in something like nihilism. That is, and it's just a kind of pun almost. It turns out that there is a kind of nothing. This is what is metaphysics about, which is the no thing. And that's the withdrawn clearing. And that's the abundance. And if nihilism is about nothing, and if there's a positive kind of nothing, then you can see that nihilism, if you interpret it in this other way, is going to lead you to understand it's true. There's nothing but beings. But now you just switch what you mean by nothing, and you see, yes, that's quite right. And boy, is that important, because it's not a negative kind of nothing. Nihilism is just misunderstood that there is the nothing that there is besides, which there is nothing besides being. Nihilism understands that nothing is a negative kind of nothing, meaning there's only being. But if you switch that around and think, yes, and the most important thing is this no thing, because that's what makes it possible for beings to show up at all, because it's the clearing, which is no thing, and it's all that other stuff, which isn't really stuff yet. It isn't a reservoir. Can't even talk about it, which we're going to call excess. As soon as you switch it around and think about it that way, and he calls that the essence of nihilism. You don't quite know why. But the essence of nihilism is this deeper truth that there is, how did I put it here? Beings are not everything. Besides beings, there is no thing. And then you discover that nihilism is a distorted understanding of that important truth. Well, let me read some passages that seem to say that. And this is what he's trying to do with Jung, and confuse him and turn him around. At the bottom of page 311. Certainly, a topography of nihilism is required, and that's this line of its process and its overcoming. When are we going to get to the line between nihilism and something after nihilism? And that's what Jung is doing. But he says, yes, the topology must be preceded by. Sorry, that has been a topography. That's the sort of laying out of the geography of lines. It's got to be preceded by a topology. A topology, namely, a discussion locating that locale which gathers being and nothing into their essence. Now we're getting a kind of positive nothing. That determines the essence of nihilism, and thus lets us recognize those paths on which the ways toward a possible overcoming of nihilism emerge. This topology is really about the difference between what's in the clearing and the clearing, I think. And that's going to tell us about a kind of nothing, which is a positive kind of nothing. I'm going to just give you some pages where this keeps coming up. On page 316 at the bottom, to put this another way, the human being holds the place of the nothing. That's a famous line from what is metaphysics, that we're the Platzhalter des Nichts. And that means that in this positive sense of nothing, we're in touch with the clearing. This sentence says that the human being holds free the locale for that which is quite other than beings, so that within this openness, something like coming to presence, being, can be given.
And the next sentence.
Yeah, I guess I'm going to see how far to go. Yes, this nothing, which is not beings and which is nevertheless given, is nothing negative, right? It belongs to presencing. Being and nothing are not given alongside one another. The one employs itself for the other in a kinship whose essential fullness we have scarcely pondered. So there we're turning it all around into this positive story. And then again on 318, at the end of the middle big paragraph, only because the question, what is metaphysics, from the start recalls the surpassing, the transcendent, the being of being, can it think the not of being, that nothing, which is originally the same as being. That's just another way of saying the nothing is the clearing. And nihilism is onto something important when it talks about, when it's concerned with the nothing, but it's got it all distorted and it's missing it, the positive way of thinking about it and experiencing it. The withdrawing of the clearing is the positive truth of nihilism in short. That's, I think, I'm claiming that's on 319. Let's try the middle. The essence of nihilism, the big paragraph, which finds its ultimate consummation in the domination of the will to will, resides in the oblivion of being. That's the ambiguous notion. We seem to respond best to such oblivion by forgetting it, which here means casting it to the winds. Yet in so doing, we fail to heed what is meant by oblivion as concealment of being. That's the positive oblivion. If we pay heed to this, we experience an unsettling necessity. Instead of wanting to overcome nihilism, we must attempt first to turn towards its essence. This is the move. Turning into its essence is the first step to which we may leave nihilism behind us. That is, we'll leave the negative kind of nihilism when we understand that the essence of nihilism is to realize that no thing is very important and makes all encounters with things possible. I think that's enough for that. But I did say that let's read more. The path of this turning takes the form of a direction of a turning back. This does not, however, mean going back to a time past in the attempt to freshen these up in some contrived form. Back here means the direction pointed at locality, the oblivion of being, from which metaphysics already receives and retains its providence. Oh, good. That's a perfect way to pull it together and summarize and stop. Metaphysics, remember, is a surpassing of being. It's looking for something because it knows there's something else than beings. But the something else than beings is no being. It's no thing. And when we understand that, then we understand that metaphysics has got a certain, that the oblivion that metaphysics is onto is the withdrawing of the clearing and the excess and the abundance, though it's onto it in the wrong way. But when we understand that, we can understand that there's something positive that metaphysics is trying to get at, and something positive that nihilism is trying to get at. And what it is, of course, what Heidegger's got, namely what we've just been talking about, clearing and abundance and aletheia. I think that's what we should stop at. I just not sure. Yeah, that does it. Okay. So, now, sort of just an overview of the sort of implications of